Hi, this is Brennan Davis from Bedrock Games and the Bedrock blog, and I'm here with Rob Conley, and we are going to be doing another episode of Game Lab where we talk about topics that we've been dealing with in gaming. So the big topic for today is races and chases, but if we have time, we're also going to get to other topics like alternate histories and going back in time. But to start, Rob, were you able to get a race or a chase in your game over the past few weeks, or did you find it a challenge?
No, it did not come up.
I I
But
I
I
had
have done them, and so I got plenty to talk about.
Okay, this was the big trouble I found, is that I always seem to have races and chases, and then when I wanted them or I was looking for them, maybe I was just too aggressively pursuing them, and so the players resisted. I don't know, but they just almost never materialized except for a couple of times, and so I got like one or two chases, and I did actually manage to do something kind of interesting that at least worked for me. You have that mechanic that I like, where you tell people to roll a d10 and don't roll a 1, and you kind of use it as you use it very broadly. It seems to cover a lot, but one of the primary functions, if I understand it, is you use it when the players are going to do something and you want to add some tension and maybe have something interesting happen that'll spice things up. And so,
Yeah, no, it's just the old adage, stuff happens. So, you roll a d20 and one comes up, so something funny happened. And if it's not, there's no consequence to failures, but if there is, it could be more severe, even though it was an all but certain task.
okay, and I'm sorry, it was your system. You use a D20 when you do that, right? Not a D10. Did I misspeak?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah, so I was using a D10 because that's the system I was using, but yours was a D20. And what I ended up doing, so I did get a chase scene through a city. I can't remember the specifics of it. I know they were running after somebody, or they were running away from people, I think. But we got one of these classic wuxia rooftop chase scenes, and I realized this would be a perfect opportunity to use a mechanic like the one that you had. So normally when I do races and chases, I just do simple roll-offs where it's like make a speed roll and then the other guy makes a speed roll, and then I kind of figure out how far they are away from each other and if they're catching up and if they catch up. And usually it ends up being a series of 2 to 3, sometimes 4 rolls. And I decided to throw in that roll a d10 and don't roll a 1. And I can't remember exactly how I used it, but I was basically trying to determine, do they encounter any massive gaps in the roof system or any kind of obstructions? And I also added a little twist to it, which was I decided that if anybody gets a 10, then something beneficial will happen. So if they,
Oh, that's good.
yeah, so if they rolled a 1, like there'd be this huge gulf between this house and the next one, and they might have to make a super duper jump check or something. But if they rolled a 10, then maybe like somebody appears in a window and is like, "Hey, come inside." Like I don't know what it would be because I don't think anybody actually rolled a 10. But I just knew if a 10 was rolled that I was gonna have something positive happen, and so I found that really useful because that was something I've always struggled with, where I didn't like keying everything to like the individual speed roll the character was making. I wanted something to kind of mix things up a little bit, and it's a really simple thing. And so I was glad that I was in that game with you where I saw you using that, because I don't think I would have thought of ever doing something like that, and it was really helpful. But yeah, so in terms of races and chases, though, I don't know. I always sort of approach them simply. I do them as a simple roll off of whatever is the closest attribute or skill to like a speed, or if I feel that it's important because it's going for a long period of time, an endurance roll of some kind. So how do you normally resolve races and chases?
Well, I back in the day, and for a long time, up to like a couple years ago, um, I would just plot speed and movement and look at the terrain that they're running through, or the city street layout,
Mm-hmm.
and kind of plot it out with not necessarily miniatures, but I would plop the map down and put I have two tiny dice and put down two tiny dice and we'll roll off and stuff like that. And it was always unsatisfactory.
Hmm.
It never seemed to capture. Well, I played live action role playing since I played a lot of live action role playing in the 1990s, and I got chased there, and it's never like it didn't feel like that.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, even with the safety rules we had in there, it was still a thrill being chased, and you're looking for things, and things come up, and I never was happy, and it seemed kind of tedious. And then I found on a rack something called Chase Cards by Pazio, and it was a deck, and it had three sets of cards: one for Dungeon, one from Urban, and one for Forest. And the idea is you shuffle the deck, like I'm doing now,
Hmm.
and then you lay out 5 cards, and that formed what they call a chase track. And you start off, and basically, if you get through all 5 cards, or you can vary it down, you can make it 3, you can make it longer if you want, but the idea here, these represent things that happen along the chase, and the first person to complete through the card, either you catch up to the people, or the pursued get through all the cards successfully and they thus escape. So the first one I drew was a pothole, and you have a choice. You can try to leap across it, or just blindly go forward. And if you leap across it, you have to make an acrobatics roll of DC 10, which is kind of easy. And if you blindly go forward, you have to make a reflex save of DC 15. And so, if one side, if you succeed that, you go to the next card, which I drew block path, and you can take 1-step, 2-step leap, or scramble up the stack.
Hmm.
Then the next one, unexpected fence. You can either do a boost and a hop, or a bust on through. Fruit cart, oh yeah, strength check, DC 20, or move that cart, intimidate, DC 15. Then the final one is a collapse roof, bounding pass, or roof crop scramble. And so that's what I've been using. It's been working out okay.
So you found that, how many years ago did you find that one?
Oh gosh, I mean, must be 10 years. I would have to say 10 years now.
And that's what you've been using consistently since you got it for this sort of situation?
When I remember to keep them on hand.
Mm. So, I mean, that to me says that's a very, I mean, because every once in a while you'll have something that you find and you just use it all the time. And so that seems like it must be a nice solid system. Is that still being made, or is that something where you'd have to get it used now because it's not?
Yeah, I just checked their website, and it's still being made. And they had a second deck out too.
Okay, can you repeat the name of it just so people listening can look it up if they're interested?
It's called GameMastery Chase Card Deck by Pazio.
Okay, and if I remember, I'm going to put a link in the description below the podcast, because I've actually never heard of those, but I can very easily visualize what you're talking about. And I think that's a good idea. I might pick up a deck today. I've been because that's kind of similar to sort of the problem that I was trying to address with the role that I was using. And so I don't know. What do you think are some pitfalls that GMs can fall into with races and chases? Like, do you think there are things that GMs should never do or should avoid? Or situations where you've just found that in your own games they don't work?
Sometimes with a random generation system, even with the card, it's hard to match the action to the terrain. So if the players have trouble abstracting what's going on,
Mm-hmm.
they really want to see it laid out on a map and plot it that way. It's going to be a disconnect.
Okay.
With that. That's the biggest problem I'm having with using the chase card, is that I really wish would have matched the map. Figure out a way to matching the map better. But I do. Basically, it's not relation to chases. It has to relate for journeys across the map.
Mm-hmm.
For a long time, my MO for that was you make a journey, you roll every day for an encounter, right?
Yep. Yeah.
And then you're just sitting there rolling, and it doesn't take very long, even if you have a good set of tables, but kind of boring for the DM as well as the player. But then I started playing Adventures in Middle-earth, and they have what they call journey rules. Now, the specifics of it is that you generate, depending on the length of the journey, up to 7 events. Okay, typically it would be 2 or 3, and then you roll up those 2 or 3 events. And basically, you can think of they use a D20. About half the events are good and half are a challenge, and the other half, or half the events are good and half the events are a complication of some sort. And the events are not all encounters. For example, they have an event called Wonders of Middle-earth, where you stumble something that could potentially inspire you, or depending on the situation, discourage you. But it has nothing to do with combat or even a skill challenge. It's just something like a waterfall or an old ruin of special, exquisite with some exquisite architecture or or something like that. And that has worked out a lot better. And I was thinking recently how to apply that to chases, where if you have a chase, you have a chart, maybe just 1 or 2 levels, and you roll up the events of the chase, and they're not. You balance the specificness with the generic of it, but you generate those events, and you look at the map, and you can place it on where you want it to happen on the map. Just the same with the journey rules for Adventures in Middle-earth. So, recently I had players go on a 200-mile long journey, and they generated five events. 3 of them were kind of clustered. 2 of them were kind of clustered in one spot, and two of the others were clustered in another spot. And because I was able to choose that based on the map, the same way with chases. So I think there'll be some something good can be made from that. Now, I don't know any rules that do quite like that, but probably I'm working on one.
That's very intriguing. I mean, I know you've talked about this game quite a bit, and I really think we should get a session in, like a live stream or something, because I really want to experience that part of the system. That has me intrigued, because I encounter that issue too with overland encounters, and there are a lot of different ways to kind of handle it. And I've tried some other things myself. I like random encounters, and I like sort of rolling every day for, every system's a little different. I have characters that have survival skill, and that allows them to sort of evade whatever challenges they would encounter. But I notice I don't really throw enough things into my encounter tables that would be like environmental challenges. I usually have 1 or 2 that almost never come up. And not enough discovery encounters, where it seemed like you were saying, well, what happens if you happen upon like a hidden temple somewhere during the journey? That's something that I think would be really interesting. I suppose the only downside is you need to have the actual temple sort of at least thought about before they get there. But yeah, I think that overland encounters can be challenging, especially when you're doing the thing where it's like a long journey, like you're saying, and you're rolling every day. And it's like you're rolling things and your brain is constantly, like, say you get 4 encounters in a row, and they're not necessarily obvious encounters. It's not something like, a tribe of bugbears coming after the party. It's like a local official or something. You have to, and it's more role play oriented.
Right.
You have to be on the ball with stuff like that, and you have to have a reason. Why is that official there? Why is this even happening? And you have to make it interesting, because you can't just have every official they meet have come to them for the same issue.
No, the journey rules. Uh, that the nice thing is if you do roll, like they have there's an entry in there where you can meet like Gandalf or not. They don't get that specific. They say you meet a major NPC.
Mm-hmm.
So first off, that was quite clever. They don't tell you a specific. Like you mentioned a hidden temple.
Yep.
Well, something based off of this for more generic campaign wouldn't tell you a hidden temple. They would say something. You find a ruin, or you just find something, and it'll be up to you to figure out based on your situation at that moment what they would find.
Okay.
And they balance that level of giving you hints, but not being so specific that it doesn't really fit with what you're doing.
Yep.
And so I think that's a key aspect of the rule, and then the ability to place it anywhere along the journey you think it makes sense.
Okay, so you don't. It doesn't have to happen in this section of the map that they're currently in. It could happen where
No.
you think it would be fitting.
Right. Yeah, the only fixed point of the journey in Adventures in Middle-earth is that you start here and you end here.
Mm.
Okay? So all the events can happen any time in that time period. So, and coupled with the actual how they design the actual event. I mean, I had a session there was nothing about. The whole adventure was driven by the journey. The players were just trying to get from Roskabol to this place on the Anduin called the Old Ford, where they had some friends that they were trying to help. And along the way, they ran into a guy they thwarted a couple sessions ago, just because I rolled up one of the encounters was something called Servants of the Enemy. The enemy being Sauron.
Mm-hmm.
And servants are not just Nazguls or necessarily orcs. They could just be evil men. And in this case, I decided, the opponent they encountered before were in league with Sauron in disguise as a necromancer. So it made sense. Okay, they're out for revenge. Well, before that, there was another encounter that I rolled called Obstacle, where it said the players meet an unexpected obstacle and the scout has to figure a way or everybody gets a level of exhaustion. And so I decided, based on the next encounter being Servant of the Enemy, that what the players actually encountered was they messed with the path, diverted the players into an area of difficult terrain, and the player has to make a good roll, or they will fall for the trap and get exhausted. And the players didn't they failed their roll and they were all exhausted. And then the next day the evil men ambushed them, and they got captured, and then they escaped later on, and that's how the whole adventure was driven, just by the journey rule.
Okay.
And the other thing, I mean, I know we're supposed to talk. This is actually relevant to Chase. I would really take a look at D&D 5th edition exhaustion rules. They strike a good balance between detail and impact on the game. So they have 6 level of exhaustion, the 6 being death. But the first level, right off the bat, if you get 1 level of exhaustion, you're at disadvantage to all die rolls. So which means you roll twice, take the lower of the 2 rolls.
Mm.
And then the second level, your move is halved, and it gets worse there. And it's not. It's written for 5th edition, but it's not 5th edition specific. So you can look it up in the system reference document and see if, give that a try, because that could be a very interesting flavor text for not just journeys, but chases. One side gets exhausted trying to chase the other, or
Yep.
the pursued gets exhausted while trying to escape from the pursuer.
Yeah, no, that's definitely, I think, important. If the chase goes on for a time, you have to start incorporating some kind of exhaustion rules, because you can't just run forever normally. So I like having those kinds of options.
But yeah, the 5th edition exhaustion rules, like I said, they balance detail with. It's not terribly complex, just a 6 level chart, but it has a major outside impact on the game.
And you really could apply that to any system because that's like not obviously not every system has disadvantage, but every system has some kind of existing floating penalty that you could invoke, and most systems have some kind of movement rule, so you can invoke that too. So that seems like something that'd be pretty easy to just slap on to any other system. Um, but yeah, I did want to move on to the next topic, unless you had something else you wanted to bring up, just because we're the time consideration. But you had mentioned that you had some alternate history stuff going on in your campaign, and I've recently had some alternate history stuff going on in my campaign, and so I thought we could talk a little bit about just the issues that time travel and changing the past can bring to an RPG.
Well, it's definitely an art, and I'm a big fan of alternate history fiction and time travel stories. Standing back to H.P. Piper's. I think Time Patrol. No, that's not H.
I'm not familiar with it, so
Piper Time. Yeah, he's a classic. Arthur from Paratime. Yeah, that's it.
What is it called?
H.P. Piper is is a science fiction author who unfortunately died in 1964, and he wrote a series of space novels. But on the other novels he wrote were called Paratime.
Mm-hmm.
It's about a time organization, and he was one of the first ones to write about it.
Okay.
That was any good, and. So, starting with him, I've always been interested in time travel and alternate history. And, for a while, it's been a tradition that, at least every other campaign involves some kind of time travel or more rarely alternate histories. And in this recent game that I had, the players took control of of their enemy's lair, who was a wizard. And the lair had this device called the Nexus, which is, you can think of it as a fantasy Stargate. It had 8 crystals that formed an address, and when the crystals are laid out, a cloud will appear, and you step through the cloud, and you appear on the other Nexus platform with corresponding to that address. And they knew from the servants that when the wizard would appear, so they waited for the cloud to appear and put a dimension door in that spot, and they aimed the other end of the dimension door at a web, so that when the wizard steps out on the platform, he immediately steps through the portal and then pops out into an area of web. And the reason they couldn't web the Nexus because the portal would rip the webs. They already established that the portal would rip the web to shreds. But unfortunately, the dimension door and the portal I ruled to be the same thing, the equivalent of putting a bag of holding in a portable hole, and it exploded, damaging the Nexus, injuring the PCs, and there's no more wizard. So the players for a while thought, hey, we won, kind of weirdly, but we won. We took out the wizard. Didn't get his treasure, but we took him out. Until they stepped out of the lair and found that they were in an alternate history where the wizard was working for a demon cult, and the alternate history had the demons ruling the world now. And so the players had the access to the lair and did the research and figured out that the wizard was teleported back into time, and now that they have to go back in time. And another characteristic of my campaign is the background. When I run a genre, I tend to use the same setting, regardless of the rules.
Okay.
So when it's fantasy, I will use my Majestic Wildland. And what the PCs do in previous campaigns, form part. I will weave into the background of the next campaign. Now, sometimes it doesn't pay off directly because it's not held in the same area of geography. But 10 years ago, after I published the Majestic Wildlands supplement, I ran a Swords and Wizardry campaign using it for a group of friends. And in that, um, for those of you with Majestic Wildlands supplement, know that I have a race called the Viridians, which are demon, low-level demons who escaped from the abyss and now exist in the world, and they once had an empire that since fell apart. Well, in that campaign, I also have half-Viridians, and which are people born of a Viridian in another race. So I had a character who played a half-Viridian and who hated his father, and that was a reoccurring theme of the campaign. Well, I decided to make it interesting that the father had him birthed because when the father was young, he got imprisoned by a rival, and then he was liberated by a man from the future that turned out to be his son. So when the time came, he had a son, so the son could go back in the past to free himself. And trust me, it hurt everybody's head trying to think of it, but I managed to do it. And so for this campaign, the character dealt with the wizard. It took place 20 years in game after the campaign I ran, and so the demon cult hated the half-Viridian character, but they had some notes on him, and there were clues in there. For example, the character was known for getting his wealth for selling pristine First Empire artifacts. Artifacts that were thousands of years ago in pristine condition and by every magic known were not counterfeit. They were the real deal. And they couldn't figure it out. But the players immediately figured out he traveled back into time. Then they pieced together from the notes the events of the last campaign. So now, and then they actually met the alternate selves of the characters that participated in that character. Unfortunately, the half-Viridian got killed by the dad in this timeline, where in my campaign, the character killed his father after he came forward back into time. So now the players are about to go to the estate of the half-Viridian's father to find the portal that sent the time portal, so they can go back, get the wizard, and prevent him from altering time, and then hopefully come back to the present.
Now I'm going to share my time travel thing. I'll try to be brief, and then I think we should talk about some of the challenges we both have encountered.
Yeah.
In my campaign, I had a similar thing, but in mine, the players had a chariot that took them back in the past, so it was kind of like the DeLorean from Back to the Future. And
Sure.
they kept using it to change the past and to their advantage. And so I had decided that every time you go through time like this, it sort of disrupts the flow, like time in general, and so cracks started forming in time. It was sort of like there was an episode of Torchwood that did something like this. So the idea was just that people would just start falling through the cracks of time into the wrong era, and I sort of used it as a cataclysmic thing that they had to clean up. And so for me, where we had the time travel adventures set in the past where they made changes that impacted the present, but we also had this issue where people were coming from the future in like mech suits and attacking them, and like divisions from like the closest equivalent to World War II in the future of the setting were coming through. They'd have like platoons of men, and so I almost had sort of you had the problem of one of them sending somebody back and then having to clean it up, and in my campaign they went back and I kind of had to clean it up, and they were kind of pulling a Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's court where they were using their knowledge of the future to improve to improve things in the past. But what are some of the, like, how do you approach time travel? Like when you see a change in time, did you have any particular method you used for gauging it, or did you kind of just sort of try to estimate what the effects of something would be?
Well, there's several ways of handling time travel. If you read the literature, the different time travels, uh, that there's several ways of dealing it, ranging from David Gerald, the man who folded himself, which is free. There's really no restriction, and you can meet yourself. It's a really trippy novel. To more restricted versions of time travel. I recommend getting GURPS Time Travel, which will lay out all the possibilities. But in general, my technique, there was one time back in the early 90s when the players uh, got involved in a relatively recent historical event, and an important character almost got killed.
Hmm.
But luckily, without DM fiat, I was able to have him escape, basically. He had some compatriot who sacrificed him, threw the missile at the character literally so this major NPCs could escape. And so what I've done since then is I send him, I make sure I contrive the situation so that whatever they do can be reasonably looked at already as a part of history.
Okay.
It would be, I don't throw them in. I focus more. I'm going to say mundane, but I don't focus on, like, they would never appear in the emperor's court. Okay,
Hmm.
and where killing the emperor can have major repercussions.
Yeah.
The Half Meridian's father, he was a powerful noble, but there are lots of powerful nobles in histories, and who's to say, what would happen if they um, got killed or not, or what was spoken to them. Now, for when the Half Meridian went back, I was prepared that if he would have given into his desire and killed his father's younger self, he would have erased himself from history.
Hmm.
But the player was pretty smart, so he knew that was a bad thing. And came really close to killing the guy, but decided the better of it and leave him alone and deal with him in the present.
Well, what you're saying, there's a couple of things in there, but one of them, it sounds like I always say to people, know what franchise you're in with time travel. Like, is it, it's sort of like an easy, quick way to sort of establish what the rules of time travel are. And if you know what movie you're in or what book you're in, then you kind of have a clear sense of what rules are governing cause and effect and what you can do and can't do. But I'm also intrigued that you like to avoid any situation where the players are going to directly impact a major event. It sounds like you're not gonna encourage them to go meet JFK or something like that in a and have them be more like dealing with regular things if they went back to the 1960s, for example, or at least not dealing directly with anybody important.
And the other thing I do is time travel magic is limited to like ninth level, the equivalent of ninth level spells, and it's not easy to set up or get executed.
Yeah.
You really have to. It literally would have to be the focus of your adventuring career to create anything that will allow you to go back into time.
Well, if it gets weaponized, like I've had parties where they were trying to use it to their advantage in the campaign I mentioned, and I realized they had an enemy who was realized what they were doing, and it became like a nuclear war where they're sort of escalating. Like everybody's trying to get the best device to change the past, and so I think if you're going back and doing that, it's like the nuclear bomb of a campaign setting.
Well, I would argue if a campaign had that level of access to time magic,
Mm-hmm.
that could send you back into time, there would be an organization, literally a time patrol form, unless there was a recent discovery. The the authorities would know about this, and they would have a time patrol to keep history straight.
Well, I think it depends on how prevalent it is, and how new it is. Because I could see it. Because in my situation, it was all relatively unknown up until this point in the campaign, and then it became a race for access. I think if you've had time for a time patrol organization to evolve, then you would have that. But I guess it depends, because time travel is so tricky, where it's almost really whoever gets time travel first is kind of the one who can set. They're the ones who get to establish the time travel organization, if they're smart about it. Like that's like the person who gets the time travel device and makes himself emperor at the beginning of time is the one who kind of, gets to set the rules, I suppose. But
Yeah, well, and then it also depends on the nature of time travel. If time travel is such, if you send yourself back into time and you step on a butterfly, you have a radically different uh, present. That's one argument. That's one style of time travel.
yeah,
The other style is that you go back time, but time is relatively resistant to change. So while there'll be differences in the events, uh, time will has a natural course that will naturally reset by. And my take on it is relative. My take is that time is relatively resistant to change. It's eased by the fact that I don't send players into important NPCs court like the Emperor
mm-hmm.
or the first Overlord, but there's also agents, active divine agents who act out of time that would set things back onto the natural course. We realized there was an alteration and will partially undo what the PCs do. So they can't undo everything, but due to other metaphysical rules that I've been consistent with, but they come back and they'll find a present that's altered but not radically different.
No, I did have divine agents in my campaign, where there was a god called the Thousandfold God, whose one of his duties had to do with time, and he became involved eventually. But it was one of these things where it kind of had to come to his attention. It wasn't the cosmology and the setting is more like the sort of heavenly bureaucracy is kind of like the real world bureaucracy, and so sometimes it takes a while for things to come to the attention of whoever's in charge. But I don't know. It's funny. I kind of go the opposite way. I like to throw them into situations where they're gonna meet the important people and potentially radically change time. But I'll also kind of have butterfly effect stuff going on, where it doesn't necessarily pan out the way you always expect it, and where minor changes can actually have, ripple effects. So my one rule of thumb I have is if a character commits any act of violence in the past, that could have a ripple effect. And if a character kills somebody, that could have a really big ripple effect.
Ah.
And so, that's like, you go back and you kill somebody 1,000 years ago. Who knows who that person is responsible for in the future? And so I developed a chart where the player, like where the players can change, like aspects of their character can change as a result of this ripple effect. And I found that pretty handy. But I do think.
What?
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Um, I really have this stuff 100% planned, but I look for opportunities to enrich the present.
Mm-hmm.
So that the players do something in the past and they come back forward. Things are still the same, but now then in the next few sessions I'll drop something, and you said, you mean these people are like that because of what I did in the past? And I would just put my stone face on, my poker face on, and say, yes, why yes, that's true, even though I kind of made it up after the fact.
Mm-hmm.
But I've gotten good at that, and the players really eat that up. Like, oh my gosh, I mean, so if I didn't go back and change it, sort of like a retroactive change, but it makes sense. The important thing, it makes sense in the context of the the background of the campaign.
Well, another thing is I find players like it when they see strong evidence that something they did had an effect and it didn't have to happen. Like their decision to do something actively produced a result that was maybe large, and they could have easily gone the other way and something different would have happened, and you weren't sort of stuck on that one result. I find players are usually appreciative of that, and time travel is one of these situations where it can manifest very, in a very big way. But with killing important people and stuff like that, my thought is you don't want to make room for that unless you're willing to deal with the consequences of it, because the consequences can be enormous. And so when I allowed for that sort of thing, I sort of had to say to myself, okay, whatever happens, and I have to live with the results. And so if they go, so we had a major character in the past named Sunan. If they had gone back and killed Sunan, that would have had catastrophic consequences. But I was prepared to deal with them. I had some ideas for how things could pan out. And so I think if you're gonna let the players meet JFK, you have to be prepared for the timeline to change, so that JFK doesn't get assassinated or something, and then think through all of the sort of outcomes. And if you don't want that, you want to set the boundaries so that sort of thing is less likely to come up. Or like you're saying, time is resistant to change. Like there's active agents that will sort of go in and repair alterations that the players might make. So yeah, I think it's a lot of fun. I think you can definitely shoot yourself in the foot as a GM with time travel. I certainly found that in my own campaign there were moments where I was like, oh, maybe I've taken this too far and I need to rethink it. But I found that if I just kind of leaned into it a little bit, I enjoyed myself. And I think what was could you mention that author again, because I think people might be interested. It was Piper.
H. Beam Piper.
And then it was the name of the book Paratime. Was that it?
Yeah, the Paratime series. Mm-hmm. He wrote another one called the Tarot Human Future History. His most famous novel was Little Fuzzy. So there's the link to his Wikipedia article.
Okay, all right.
His books are in the public domain too, so you can find them on Gutenberg and download them to your Kindle.
There's another good one that I'd recommend. I think it was by Asimov, called The End of Eternity, which I really liked, and that was one that was about a bureau that was basically trying to manage time, and it was this bureau that was sort of outside of the timeline. I forget how they did it, but they basically were able to withdraw themselves from the timeline at this bureau and then mess with time to maximize happiness for all of humanity. And it's a very interesting story. I won't give away what happens, but it's one that I am always sort of going to for my time travel games.
I also posted the link to the Wikipedia link to The Man Who Folded Himself. That's by David Gerald, who wrote Troubles with Tribbles from Star Trek.
Yeah, we just reviewed one of his episodes for Babylon 5 not too long ago.
That is literally time travel unhinged.
Okay, I'm gonna try to post these links into the description below the podcast. If it's not there, remind me. I'll put them in. But okay. I tend to be forgetful. But we are getting close to a time crunch here, so I did want to get into. We were going to talk about the afterlife in games, but we can maybe save that for next time.
Sure.
You had an article on something to do with publishing that I wanted to, that you'd posted on your blog, and I just wanted to give you the floor to sort of talk about it, and we can sort of see if anything comes up in conversation here as well.
Well, in recent years, One Bookshelf, who runs RPG Now and Drive Through RPG, have worked with publishers, notably Wizards, to create what they call community content programs, which are it's a pretty important and significant innovation, where a publisher will say, if you publish your work within this program, and only within this program, then we will allow you access to pretty much all of our IP. Now, for Wizards, they don't allow it to everything in their catalog. And specifically, they currently allow any of the D&D 5e books anything from Forgotten Realms, anything from the Ravenloft uh, series. So, there's like thousands of work on there and several platinum sellers on there by these authors who have contributed, which means they got over 1,000 sales. So it's been significant. But the complaint and problem I have is when authors contribute their original work and they have this clause in their license agreement, which can only be found once you fill out the form to submit your title. There's a box, fairly large box, but filled with text that will print the 3 or 4 pages of legalese. If you copy and paste that and read it, it says, in addition to agreeing that this work can only be released on the community content program, which I have no problem with, you also agree that all derivative works will be limited to the community content program. So that means if I released a product with something to take it, this is a trivial example, mind you, but something called a Spear of Night, okay? I wrote some flavor text, tied it to, say, like Neverwinter in Forgotten Realms, and give it some D&D 5th edition stat. Now, normally, if I didn't sign a work-for-hire contract with a publisher, but, I could take that, as an author, strip out anything specific to another publisher's IP, and if I didn't have the right to the game, give it the stat for another game, like switch it from D&D 5th edition to, say, RuneQuest, or RuneQuest Legend, which is under an open license, and publish it. But it's obvious, you look at the two, it's a different version of the Spear of Night, but so it's derived from the Spear of Night, but it's different that it's not exactly, so therefore you can publish it. But by specifically agreeing not to do that, you lose that right to do that. Now, I have to say, for something like the DM's Guild, that's not a big deal as I'm making it out to be, because it's centered on the Forgotten Realms setting. Okay? They don't want people to post their own original setting on the DM's Guild. Okay? So I think it's not right, but they got original settings. They can't risk their IP on that.
Okay.
But there are other community content programs like the Traveler's Aid Society, especially the ones from Cypher and Cortex, where the focus is on rules where they do want publishers publish their original setting. So normally, unless again it's for work for hire, normally when publishers get another company, and you dealt with this, with the Pundit and Arrows of Indra. Normally when publishers sign these agreements, it's only for a specific work, and if the author wants to take it around and release it under a different game, most of the time they can do that. They can't use any of the art, any of the layout, but they can take their words, strip out whatever the content of the rules that they're using for that publisher, and publish it. It happens all the time. But by publishing Cortex, Cypher, Traveler's Aid Society, your own original setting, you give that right up.
Okay.
In fact, they don't want you to use a setting that was already published. In other words, and I'm not sure how the Traveler's Aid Society would have dealt it, because this is where I first became really aware of it. But Traveler's Aid Society was formed in the wake of Mongoose Traveler 2nd edition. There's the Mongoose Traveler 1st edition had a traditional open content system reference document that third-party publishers have been using. Several of these were ready to hop on the Traveler's Aid Society until they saw that no derivative content clause.
Yeah.
But now that I went to OBS and ask them, and I didn't get an answer. And finally, this year, I got an answer to some of my questions. And one of the things they didn't want is I asked them if I publish, the Land of Alpha under the open game license, and then made it a version for that for fifth edition or I would use Traveler's Aid for Traveler, and actually I used a Majestic. If I made Majestic Star for another set of rules under an open game license, and then turn around and repurpose Majestic Star for the Traveler's Aid Society, would you allow that? And they said no. If the content appeared elsewhere, we don't want it on our community content program. So these third-party Traveler publishers, they were kind of hosed from the get-go.
Okay. Okay.
And I really have a problem with that. I mean, I don't have a problem with, if I write Majestic Wildlands for Mongoose Traveler Second Edition, I have no problem with that work
Mm-hmm.
remaining on that, ever only appearing on the Traveler's Aid Society. But I do have a problem not being able to use all that material and elsewhere.
Yep.
I think the compensation, 50% of royalty, is 50% of the cover price. It's not worth it. It's not a fair deal.
Okay. Okay. Now, what has the reaction generally been to the blog post?
Pretty much split, 50-50. I mean, 50 saying, I'd say 25% are really outraged by this. The other 25 say, yeah, that sucked. We should never post anything up there. The other 25 is like, percent is like, well, it's buyer beware. The publisher should have read everything. It's his fault if he gets himself in that trap.
Okay. See, I think,
and then the last 25%, it's for beer and pretzels, guys. If you have any interest in publishing yourself, you should not touch these programs. But it's for the beer and pretzel guy, and these companies have valuable IP that they're letting them be released. And I understand their point, but if there's some point where a deal is unfair, no matter how valuable. If it's Disney, Mickey Mouse, I don't care how valuable Mickey Mouse is. There's always going to be a deal that Disney potentially could make that would be viewed as unfair.
Yeah. Well, also, I think if you're specifically doing something where you're going after a more amateur crowd, and there's a big spectrum of people that are involved in RPG publishing. Some of them are on the very sort of professional end. Some do it more as a hobby, and some are sort of the beer and pretzels crowd. I think when you're trying to appeal to that crowd and you're doing something that you want, that broad a spectrum of people to engage in, you should be as clear as possible, because not everybody's going to be bringing a lawyer to the table. And so I think the biggest issue that I kind of have with this is what seems like a lack of clarity. And it seems like that was what your blog post was trying to do, was sort of give people a clear idea of what this all really means.
Right. Even I would take advantage of these programs if DM's Guild ever gave permission to use Greyhawk. I got some stuff that I would post for that. Mm-hmm. I like Greyhawk, and I wrote some material that doesn't really work anywhere else, and I would happily post it and make a few bucks off of it. So it's not all bad. It's just this one clause and how it's not clear what you're giving up. And what I'm concerned is for the DM's Guild, which I didn't mention earlier, is, D&D is the foundation of modern fantasy. Mm-hmm. Okay? Until the release of The Lord of the Rings, it literally was the foundation. Now it's kind of like a mix between what people saw in the Lord of the Rings movie and D&D, but since D&D is partially based on Tolkien anyway, it's all one mess. So you get these people who release a body of work on RPG now, specifically the D&D Guild Adepts that they're now promoting. How anything they're going to do in fantasy from here on out is not going to be considered derivative.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Well, that's a deeper question than I see. That's where I think the clarity issue becomes important, because I see stuff like this and I want to know what all the implications are, and it's way over my head in terms of the legalese. So And I think that's, again, I think that's part of the issue with this stuff is when, you know, you have a lot of people who are not necessarily going to be bringing lawyers to the table who aren't sure what it all means, and so that's where, again, I think,
And one more point I want to raise is that I don't think OBS is being necessarily evil in all this or wrong. I do feel that it's been a long recognized issue in the creative industry, what I guess I would call throwing stardust in a novice author
mm-hmm.
Eyes. People are very prone to that. They're
Yes,
new.
yes.
They don't have a track record. It's the public. They don't know what's going on, and literally the publisher holds all the cards in that scenario. And some publishers are bad and they take advantage of it. Some publishers, they don't take advantage of it exactly, but let's face it, it's a novice artist. They can't treat them like an established guy, like say Salvatore or Janelle Jacquet or Monty Cook.
Yep.
They don't get the 5-star treatment. However, it's enough of a problem that Congress has recognized this and put a provision in copyright law that I believe is 2 decades after release of a copyright, the author can take it back.
Yep.
If they go through the hoops, they can take it back and get the copyright back. And it most recently happened with Steve Jackson and Melee and Wizard. Back in the day, Melee and Wizard were published by Metagaming as these little pocket games, and eventually became the role-playing game Into the Labyrinth. For a variety of reasons, Steve Jackson, when he formed Split with Metagaming, was not able to secure the rights to those games like he did with Ogre and some other games, and the guy who ran Metagaming just went off the radar and wouldn't talk to anybody, or when he did, the offered price so exorbitant that nobody would bother. But because of that law, in 2017, Steve Jackson was able to do the proper filing, and regardless of what the guy at Metagaming thinks, Steve Jackson now owns the copyright back. But so my view is, why do we force? I'm not asking that, like the top one on the list of the DM Depth Guild title is Xanador's Lost Notes to Everything. I'm not asking for OBS to say, oh, it's okay for that to be released elsewhere, but I think it should be okay that if the author had some good ideas, some characters that he wants to repurpose for another setting, another game, that they should be allowed to do so.
No, I mean, it was an interesting discussion. I followed some of the conversations around this, and people really are split in a lot of different ways in this one. And again, I think people can disagree, but I think it is important for at least the clarity to be there. So,
I agree.
Yeah, because I mean that really does make it. I mean, I don't know. Like I said, not many people make a lot of money in this industry. And the people who do are people like OBS and some of the bigger publishers and some of the mid-tier publishers, and then there are a few people that have found ways to be successful and earn a living. But a large portion of the hobby of the industry is hobby. It's people doing it because they love it, but they also are bringing IP to the table that they care about. So I think people should know what they're getting themselves into. I think we're coming up on the hour mark, so I'm gonna end it there. We'll post a link to the blog post that Rob did. People should check it out. And I'm sure you have an extensive comment section at this point on that blog post, or was the conversation relegated?
There's about eight comments, which is a little higher than normal. Well, I'm sure I'm going to get more now.
I saw threads on it, so I know people have at least expressed their thoughts elsewhere. I think I saw the one at the RPG site, and I don't know. I'll see if I can find others. But But yeah, so we'll be back on next time. I don't. I guess maybe we'll pick up with the afterlife on that episode. I don't know yet. And,
Yeah, that sounds good.
okay, yeah, I'd like to talk about the afterlife because it's a complex topic, and I've been experimenting with it, and I'm finding that it's something where you can really go in all kinds of directions with it, and I'm just curious what other people, on the show think about this. This Friday we're going to be doing a discussion on Yes, Madam. This is a really sort of classic action movie from the 80s starring Michelle Yeoh. And I think on Wednesday, me and Adam have finished Babylon 5, so we'll be doing a movie called Outland. And then we're going to dive into a show called Return of Condor Heroes. And I have some other things coming up, but I'll announce them in the coming days. And until then, we will talk to you later.